Hi everyone! Welcome to Speech 120 and welcome din sa ating very first video lecture titled Oral Interpretation. In this lecture, you will be learning about the basic concepts and processes of OI. Okay, so I hope that you have already watched the 3 poems that I asked you to see on YouTube. 2 poems from Maya Angelou and 1 spoken word poetry titled White Privilege. I hope that you felt something by watching these performances, that you were moved in some way. I want to ask, why perform literature? Why perform these poems in the first place? Here are some answers. First is to appreciate literature. Have you ever experienced this before? May na-encounter kayo na poem somewhere. It's written. Maybe you were in high school, maybe nasa kayong poem, and nagtataka ka dahil hindi mo maintindihan at all. Parang super deep English lang niya. But when an excellent actor performed it in front of you, you began to understand the piece. And aside from that, you were even moved to tears. I hope that you will realize how big your role is in this situation if you are an OI performer. It is through you that people will appreciate literature and understand many stories through your performances. Okay? Next, to improve presentation skills. So if you're going to look at it, ang OI falls under the performance track. And rhetoric and performance are sisters. Why? Because aside from the fact that maraming research na pwedeng mag-converge ang dalawang disciplines, we also teach how to perform and how to present in both fields. Kung sa rhetoric, merong public speaking, here in performance, we have oral interpretation. And we're going to tackle very soon how to use your voice in sharing a story. How to change your voice if you're performing a certain character. How you should do certain types of gestures, posture, depending on the piece that you are performing. So indeed, if you are trained in OI, you will be able to improve your presentation skills. Next, we perform literature to share our experiences. They say, pipili ka daw ng isang literary piece to perform only if nakikita mo ang ilang aspeto ng buhay mo sa piece of literature na yon. Meron ka na bang napiling poem para sa ating poetry performance requirement here in class? I'm pretty sure napili mo yan dahil naiintindihan mo yung sinasabi ng author. So they say, when we perform literature, it's like we are sharing our experiences with others. It's a way for us to be vulnerable. It's a way for us to be seen, and it's a way for us to represent ourselves and our identity. Okay? And last one, we perform literature to develop an inclusive sense of the other. So we have seen Maya Angelou perform 2 of her poems. We've also heard slam poetry on white privilege. Even though we are not American citizens, even though we're not African Americans, in a sense, after watching those performances, you understand what they went through as a people. Because there are similarities in their humanity with ours, right? So we can feel the same sense for justice and the same sense of striving for equality with them when we heard and watched their performances. I hope that after those poems, you will understand why there is a movement called Black Lives Matter in a deeper level. Okay, so now that we are in a pandemic, why is performing literature important? Why is performing art important? So if you're going to read this quote by Audrey Azoulay, the head of UNESCO, bringing people together, inspiring, soothing, and sharing. These are the powers of art, the importance of which has been made emphatically obvious during COVID-19. So we performers, artists, our role in this pandemic is to make art to heal others. So I hope that our poetry performance will be a way for you to inspire healing in the midst of this chaos. And if you're going to look at this quote, a very famous quote in Dead Poet Society, we don't read and write poetry because it's cute. We read and write poetry because we are members of the human race. And the human race is filled with passion and medicine, law, business, engineering. These are noble pursuits and necessary to sustain life. But poetry, beauty, romance, love, these are what we stay alive for. All right. So what is oral interpretation? Now that we have established the importance of performing literature. And why is it being taught in speech communication? Anong relationship nito sa communication discipline? So, let us read the definitions of OI from two famous authors. Charlotte Lee said, interpretation is the act of communicating to an audience a work of literary art in its intellectual, emotional, and aesthetic entirety. So ano ang gist nito? When we do OI, we're actually communicating a message to our audience. And what is the medium? The piece of literature that you chose. And how do you communicate this meaning to an audience? You have to know the intellectual side of the piece of literature that you chose. Kailangan inanalyze mo siya. Ano ba ang meaning nito? For example, nakahanap ka ng poem na pwedeng feminist lens ang iyong gagawing pag-aaral dito. Ibig sabihin, ang iyong performance will be about the empowerment of women. And that boils down to your intellectual analysis of the piece. Second, of course, is emotional. That's why you have to use your body and your voice in delivering this piece of literature through performance. And of course, aesthetic entirety. It should please the audience's senses of sight, okay, the emotions that they will feel, etc. And here's another definition by Judy Jordan. Interpretation is an artistic process of studying literature through performance and sharing that study with an audience. So when you talk about OI, hindi lang panay perform. Kasama po dito ang pag-aaral, sharing that study with an audience. Okay? So what makes a good OI performance good? Here are three of the interpretation ingredients that your OI performance should have. Dapat daw merong intertextuality. Yung tawag doon. What does that mean? If your text as a performer coincides with the text of the piece of literature and the texts of the audience. So for example, you're going to use Till I Rise by Maya Angelou as your performance piece. Okay? So that poem in itself already has its own meaning. But if you, let's say me, a Filipino woman, will deliver it to an audience and perform it, there is a change in meaning, right? And the audiences is also present. They will be the one who will interpret your performance for themselves. They will have their own meaning of it. So pag nag-coincide ng meaning ng literary text, ang meaning mo and interpretation mo of that text, and the audience's emotional reactions and intellectual reactions to your performance, that is a perfect OI experience. All right. So what is intertextuality? If we're going to read this quote by Beverly Whitaker Long, when we read texts, we write or produce them. We relate them to texts we already know. We connect them to other texts and to other performances of those texts. We make sense of a text in terms of another, and in terms of what we already know is similar. So what does that mean? It's very important for you to know na lahat daw ng pipiliin mong poem, you choose it because you're thinking that meron kang experience na natatouch ng piece of literature, and at the same time, you know that if you deliver it to your audience, their lives will also be touched because there are aspects of their identity which they can relate to that performance. That is intertextuality. Now, let's move on to the 3 types of texts that you can use for an OI performance. Okay? So first is prose. Okay? What is prose? So prose is anything that could be fiction or non-fiction. Okay? So these are stories written in sentences, paragraphs with no strong rhythm base, meaning, the regular communication patterns that we have. A regular sentence written in regular paragraphs. So if you're going to look at fiction, an example of this is if you're going to perform chapter 1 of your favorite novel. If you're going to perform it in a way in a prose, even the parts of the narrator is included there. And if you're going to look at non-fiction prose, you can even perform newsletters. Going to read newsletters, diaries, those kinds of stuff. Okay, so that is prose. And then we also have drama. So if you have already performed in a school play and you saw the script for the first time, makikita mo na iba siya sa itsura ng novel eh. For example, if you're going to look at the book Harry Potter and the Cursed Child, okay, makikita mo yung name ng character, line nila. Susunod na segment, name ng character, line nila. And may sagutan, right? So it's very much different to prose. And because drama it's written with characters, it has implied actors, and it's written in dialogue form. And it's also intended for actors to perform on stage. Okay, now the third one. We have poetry. So poetry, nung mga bata tayo, alam natin basta nagra-rhyme poem siya, di ba? Pero ngayon meron ng spoken word poetry, which is a combination of poem and prose. Okay, so what is poetry? It's highly imagistic. Yan. It's written in condensed or heightened language. It's stylized. That's a stylized syntax. And there are figures of speech present that are not found in ordinary communication. So yun ang pagkakaiba ng prose tsaka poetry. Flowery ang poetry, and it's meant to be that way. Okay, so here in our class, Speech 120, we will do poetry performances. Okay? And I hope that at this point, meron na kayong idea kung ano ba talaga yung gusto nyong i-perform. At ang ating theme ay quarantined lives. So you have to choose a piece, whether literal na quarantined lives or metaphorical quarantined lives ang theme ng iyong poetry. So now, ang susunod na question, how do I prepare for an OI performance? Right? So make sure that you write this down and you start doing them as early as now. Right, so let's begin. So the first is, you have to choose a literary piece. Okay? So kung may napili na kayong poetry ngayon, or kung wala pa, just make sure that it falls under these 3 elements. First, universality. Okay? Meaning the piece of poetry that you have chosen should have universal themes that human beings can relate to. So for example, if you're going to look at the poem Still I Rise by Maya Angelou in terms of the universality criteria, universal ba siya? Oo. Why? Because it talks of the story of resilience, the story of self-love, the story of dignity. At yung mga themes na to, lahat yan nararanasan ng lahat ng tao sa buong mundo. Kaya pagpipili kayo ng poem, make sure that it's understandable by anyone, anywhere. Love, family, justice, death, life, these kinds of things. Alright. What's the second one? The second one is individuality. What makes your poem unique? So in the Still I Rise poem, it's how Maya Angelou starts with parang defeat leading to victory. Defeat, yet still I rise. And the repetition of Still I Rise is what makes it a very memorable poem. So what makes your choice of poem memorable? Do you think if you perform it in front of an audience, after a few years, they will still remember your performance? Make sure that it is unique. It has individuality. And what's the last one? It's suggestion. Suggestion means there is room for interpretation of the poem. Hindi binibigay ng poem lahat-lahat. What does that mean? So again, let's go to Still I Rise as an example of a poem with great suggestion. If I'm going to perform that poem as a Filipino woman, magkakaroon na siya ng pwedeng ibang klaseng interpretation. Right? Ang Still I Rise in the context of a woman here in the Philippines. So, mag-isip pa kayo. Yung poem na pinili ninyo, in what ways siya pwedeng ma-interpret? Anong mga story ang pwede niyang matouch? Right? So that is suggestion. This room for interpretation for the performer. Alright, so let's say you've chosen a perfect literary piece and that piece falls under these three criteria. What's your next step? It is analyzing the piece. So here in Speech 120, you will be using dramatistic analysis and modal analysis for your poem, and you will be tackling that next week through written modules and assigned readings. But now I'm going to tell you just a bit of a background on what it is. Okay? So in dramatistic analysis, after you've chosen a poem, you have to ask these questions to yourself. Who speaks? What is the speaker saying? To whom? Where and when is this happening? And how is the act delivered? Okay? So through these questions, you will begin to understand your text deeper. Because if you understand all these questions, you know the answers to these questions, it'll be easier for you to translate your meaning, to communicate your meaning to your audience, right? And there are also other ways of analyzing the piece. There are the feminists and the Marxist, post-colonial ways of interpreting a poem. And we'll also tackle that next week. Okay? So in relation to this is your first learning entry question. It's related to the analysis of the piece. Okay? Based on your reading of a brief history of theories of interpretation, explain the evolution of oral interpretation using the lens of first elocution, second expression, third impression, and ethnography. So yung kayang mga tanong kanina na who is speaking, why is the speaker speaking, and how, does it fall under elocution, expression, impression, or ethnography? Okay, so you have to read the reading in order to answer this learning entry question. Okay, so now we're done with analyzing the piece. Next, of course, is rehearsing for the performance. So always remember that OI is a full body experience. You have to rehearse for it. Okay, say for example, your analysis leads you to the interpretation na yung main character na nagsasalita ay isang old woman, and it's a feminist interpretation. And syempre, kayo, medyo mga bagets pa kayo, how will you use your voice to show your audience that you're an old woman? How will you use your body to portray an old woman? And how will you portray an old woman and at the same time framing her as an empowered woman? Okay, so these are the things that you have to coordinate in your rehearsal. How do I bring my analysis to life using my body and my voice? Right? So good luck. In the third week of our module, we will be having a Zoom session and we will see how you are doing in your own rehearsals for your performance. Okay, so once you're done rehearsing for the performance, we're going to the last one, which is preparing the introduction for your poetry performance. So parang ano lang din yan, speech. Hindi tayo magsisimula kaagad sa body. Dapat may introduction. Kung yung performance piece yung body, yung introduction, kayo mismo ang gagawa. So, ito yung contents of the introduction of your performance. You have to mention the title of the work, the name of the author, interesting details about the work, and your approach to the material. Make sure that this is stated in a way that will catch the audience's attention. Right? So, exciting, right? So once that you're done writing your introduction, you will move on to the last stage, the most exciting and the most fulfilling part. It's owning the stage and delivering your message across the audience through your performance. So that's it. Good luck in your preparation and rehearsals, and I'll see you all very soon. Bye!